remedying or repairing harm that individuals have suffered through reparations, for example. I am also a practitioner who has consulted universities on their efforts to confront their legacies of the past. So for example, the legacy of slavery, I consulted Georgetown and created a course to facilitate truth and reconciliation for its students while the university deals with this issue. I've also consulted K through 12, institutions of higher education and anti-racism. I've worked with community organizations, the city, human rights groups, all in sort of this area of truth, justice, accountability, and repair for harm. And on the right-hand side are just some pictures of some of the journals that I've published in. Nautilus is a science journal, GeoJournal is a geography journal, Journal of Peace Research is international relations focused on economics and conflict, and diverse issues in higher education, looking at reporting mechanisms that are used in academic associations when sexual harassment, discrimination have been used. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll go through each person's biography quickly, and then we'll move into our individual presentations. So Dr. Assata Zerai is the professor of sociology and vice president for equity and inclusion at the University of New Mexico. At the helm of the DEI, she plans for resources and documents impact of efforts to improve equity at UNM. She is professor emeriti at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, where she served from 2002 to 2019. She's a decolonial feminist scholar. She has published 5 books spanning multiple topics, including cultural inclusivity, maternal and child health, African women's access to safe water, sanitation, and mobile technology, and making the work of marginalized scholars. I would also add to this that I think she's one of the leading scholars in using institutional ethnographies and restorative justice as a way to deal with harms within a university, and I'm excited to work with her. Next slide, please. Alfred Mathewson, Dennis Mathewson's bio, 38 years, a Lobo, tenured in 1989. He's an emeritus professor of law and former dean at the UNM School of Law, former director, UNM Africana Studies, member, interdisciplinary working group for algorithmic justice. We share membership in this group together. Member, UNM Retiree Association Board, and a community resource, which is absolutely true and not enough to describe who he is in the community and to all of us. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I want to just tell you a little bit about this fellowship so you understand how it connects to the work on the Truth Commission. So I am the inaugural fellow for the Academic Leadership Fellowship, which is designed to bring in a professor to do research on a particular topic, as well as to be part of the staff and do the work of DEI, which I've learned an incredible amount in. I'm so excited to be a part of this. So the focus of the work that I'm doing is to address harms. Did someone say something? Okay, such as targeting, bullying, and attacks against UNM Black faculty. Using an intersectionality approach to shed light on the matrix of domination and the complexity of harms that have, for example, historical, layered, overlapping, and intersecting qualities that UNM faculty experience. What are the layers of identities that we have that interact with the structures of oppression that lead to targeting in multidimensional ways? Not just race, not just gender, not just class, both, but then to also consider that we have faculty who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, to understand that targeting a faculty of color can also be based on our sexual identity, our gender identity construction. And that in order to understand or have a holistic view and understanding of the harms directed towards Black faculty, we must use this perspective. Examples of targeting would include threats to academic freedom, threats of lynching, lynching nooses placed on Black faculty cars, cyber attacks, sexual harassment, targeting in and outside of class, targeting based on multiracial, ethnicity, religion, language, citizenship, sexuality, and gender identity construction, as well as the targeting of the program of Africana Studies as an institution itself, which represents not only the department, but Black faculty on campus. So my primary fellowship activity is to design a UNM Black Faculty Truth Commission in order to address these harms, to begin to document and establish the truth of what happens, its multidimensionality, and then to begin to figure out how we can give voice to faculty and eventually how we might address it. Next slide, please. So we are part of a national movement and a global movement in which universities are confronting their past. One of the mechanisms that they're using is truth-telling mechanisms. So for example, I've mentioned that there are many universities, there are about 40 universities as of 2019, who have a legacy of slavery in the sense that the university owned enslaved individuals, may have maintained plantations. Their labor was used to build buildings on campus. When, for example, in the case of Georgetown, when the Catholic Church no longer wanted to engage in the sale of people, had breeding programs, for example. And it has been in the last 5 to 10 years that there's really been movement in addressing these issues. And so just to give you 2 examples of truth-telling mechanisms, a truth commission is a body, an investigative body created to uncover, to investigate, to study the legacy of harm, in this case for a university, to document what has happened, to understand the past and the present in order to understand how to go forward in the future. So Brown University, the Brown University Steering Committee on the left is an example of a truth commission or truth-telling mechanism. And then Georgetown's Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation is another example. We fit into this tradition. UNM is unique and important, and everyone should pay attention to it. We are one of the few universities addressing multiple legacies of harm simultaneously. The targeting of Black faculty, the argument that the murals in the library are racist, the naming of the buildings, the seal. So there are totem poles that have been stolen from Indigenous communities that must be returned, and the university has been involved in those negotiations. So we need to pay attention to UNM locally, internationally, and also nationally in the United States. Next slide, please. So what are the ways that universities are confronting their past, and so how do we fit into this? Working groups of service, truth commissions, reporting mechanisms that already exist that are being used to handle claims from faculty, for example, which the UNM has, institutional ethnographies, which we've talked about, that UNM, I think, is a leader in using as a truth-telling mechanism, oral history projects, reparations. So for instance, the student referendum for reparations at Georgetown University, memorial projects, memorials on campus, memory projects that are done, especially among students, to remember what has happened and to also try to prevent it from happening again. Institutional creation, transformation, and death. Using the classroom as a space for truth and reconciliation, as well as teaching circles, which can give an opportunity for professors to talk about how do they turn their classrooms as a safe space for truth and reconciliation to deal with the past and the present. To have archival and repository spaces in university libraries to collect documentation related to legacies of harm, to create research centers, and then also physical spaces created for remembrance or in remembrance. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you part of why I'm so passionate about protecting faculty and for this project for Black faculty in particular. In 2002, I was a faculty member at the University of Arizona. I was a new assistant professor, and I was sitting in my office on October 28, 2002, and a student killed three female professors in their office, two in class, one in her office. I was sitting in my office. I walked out. I came back. This is a long time ago. We had answering machines, and my mom left a message. And it's like, I'm very concerned, Dr. Powers, please call me. And she saw on CNN that 3 female professors had been killed, but they didn't say the names of those individuals. So she was worried. And so on that day, a student had come to campus, had failed out of the School of Nursing, wanted to hold these professors accountable according to his views, and shot one in her office and 2 in their class while they were co-teaching a class, and held the class hostage. And then when he heard the police coming, he killed himself. It turned out that he had bomb training, so they had to shut down campus for a day or 2 to check every single space and every single car on campus. And then in the aftermath, the university faculty, staff, students had to figure out how to go forward. That had a profound impact on me because I had never considered the vulnerability of faculty to students, to people outside of the university, and has made me very concerned about the protection and safety, physical safety of faculty, also of academic freedom, our right and responsibility and obligation to say what we think. Next slide, please. And so here's context, right? This week, we have talked extensively about, especially yesterday, the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. But nearly 1 year ago, George Floyd was murdered. And nearly 1 year ago, and this is a picture of the Albuquerque protest. And if we could go to the next slide, nearly 1 year ago, Dr. Charles Becknell Jr. was targeted with threats of being lynched at his home. The Program of Africana Studies website was attacked in a cyber attack. There was a multi-dimensional cyber attack of the library, DEI, the Program of Africana Studies. So that was April 30th, 2020. So here I am again in a situation where faculty have been threatened and unsafe as a function of what they do, as being not just as Dr. Charles Becknell Jr. himself, but also as the Director of Africana Studies, as the institution that represents us, which brought me into working on the Truth Commission to address the threats and harms that were directed at him and the institution. Next slide, please. So nearly 1 year ago, in response to the threat of lynching and the cyber attack against Black faculty, Dr. Becknell Jr. and the Program of Africana Studies, UNM DEI, in conjunction with the President's Office and other units on campus, held an anti-racist town hall meeting to talk about these issues, to condemn the violence, and to figure out how to go forward. At the time, I was the interim chairperson of the Black Faculty Alliance on campus. And we worked together to try to figure out how could we protect faculty, how could we address what was happening, and in the process protect Dr. Charles Becknell Jr. and the Program of Africana Studies. And we decided to write a statement. Many units on campus wrote statements condemning the murder of George Floyd, condemning the violence against Dr. Becknell Jr. and the Program of Africana Studies, but we were the only one that called for action. And in consultation with Dr. Becknell Jr. and the members of the Black Faculty Alliance, what would action look like? And so what we called for, and there is a legacy, a history of this on campus. Dr. Nancy Lopez, Dr. Jamal Martin had been working on a proposal for a Truth Commission to deal with harms on campus, including towards Black faculty. Dr. Charles Becknell Jr. had been interested in creating a truth commission of some kind and said, as the survivor of these threats, he thought the most appropriate way to move forward was to call for a Black Faculty Truth Commission, as well as a rapid response team. So the Truth Commission to study the legacy of harms towards Black faculty, to think about how do we move forward, the rapid reaction force to come up with a way forward to what do we do when a cyber attack happens? What do we do when a threat happens? And so Dr. Assata Zerai led the team who put together a cybersecurity protocol that involved UNMPD, the IT department, on what do we do when something like this happens, and to think about how do we protect faculty at that moment. The threats to Dr. Charles Becknell Jr. were a week and a half before the date that they gave that he would lynch him. So what is the university's responsibility in protecting us, for example? Next slide, please. So the UNM Black Faculty Truth Commission, as I said, is to address these. It started out to address very specifically these threats of lynching, the cyber attack, and then threats towards Black faculty on campus. So the Black Faculty Alliance called for it. In truth commissions, it is very important to establish who is the source or what is the source of authority so that it is seen as legitimate. The source of authority is the UNM Office of the President, who delegated operating authority to the Division of Equity and Inclusion, who then Dr. Assata Zerai, who is the VP of the unit, created a Truth Commission committee that we both chair to design the Truth Commission as a committee with input from other faculty on campus, as well as Black faculty in the community. Next slide, please. So originally, we wanted it to be backward looking and forward looking, to do an investigation and to lay out the kinds of harms that have been levied towards Black faculty, and then to look forward, could we create some sort of reporting mechanism that Black faculty would trust and feel safe to say what has happened? Many faculty have not reported what has happened to them because they have been very concerned about using existing reporting functions on campus. Next slide, please. So what was the methodology that we were thinking about? That we would access existing data, first of all, to begin to paint a picture of the kinds of claims and harms that have happened, using UNM police reports, DEI, climate surveys, and legal records. And then to start thinking about collecting new data, survivor testimony, video and written survey. Maybe we might have focus groups of people who suffered harms and that they might feel safe in that space to tell their stories. Next slide, please. And so we spent an incredible amount of time trying to think about these issues. And one of the most important is, how do you create a safe space for people to tell their stories? And how might people prefer to tell their stories? We even investigated the data that would be generated, quantitative and qualitative. Where would you store it in perpetuity, considering that universities are non-state actors, professors can be employed for years, 30 or 40 years. And how do you tell your story confidentially with privacy and it be stored somewhere in perpetuity so that you don't suffer retaliation? So I would really like to thank Dr. Zerai, Dr. Teresa Neely, who spent a great deal of time looking at commercial entities, a third party who might separately store this information, but you have to worry about them being taken over and then the property rights over that data. And then what about the university? And Dr. Neely is the one that shared with us that there's a dark institution in the UNM library where you can put data, put a decision rule on it. You can't open it for 100 years and you have to have an ID. But how do you guarantee that the highest levels of executive leadership cannot access that data before that time? And these were concerns of members of the Black Faculty Alliance. So our question became, how do you think about justice and the problem of small numbers? How do you provide a safe space for truth? How do you protect that data? How do people tell their stories and not either reveal themselves or accidentally start an OEO case, not knowing that they have revealed that what has happened satisfies a criteria for a class of a vulnerable class that has been targeted? So these were the issues we uncovered. Survivors vary on if and how they want to share their stories. Some people said, I'm not going to testify. I'm not going to give testimony, either written or in person. I will not be made vulnerable. Others said, do not take my voice away. I want the opportunity to tell my story in public. So we're considering, why is a portfolio of truth-telling mechanisms needed? The problem of how to protect those who share their stories, storing and protecting data in perpetuity, how to tell a story without starting an OEO case, which we really need to thank Liz Hutchinson for, who made us aware of this. And I'd like to thank Professor Melinda Price at the University of Kentucky for making me aware of the next one. Would need to sign agreements with the university to avoid responsibility for harm. So we don't think about, in the process of truth-telling, the ways that someone who is a survivor could be harmed by the process, either their data being leaked. For example, maybe they suffer psychological consequences of telling their story, which is quite common in truth commissions around the world. So what kinds of agreements would need to be signed? That there are too few Black faculty on campus, right? Many of us are first and only. We have faculty who are the only in their college, only in their department, first in those circumstances. So you're dealing with faculty who have never dealt with a colleague who's a Black faculty member, or in their national disciplines, which means that the harms that they are suffering nationally and within the universities. And then there are those of us who've worked at multiple universities. And so you've experienced harms in multiple spaces, not just one university. Next slide, please. So what we decided to do is to create or design a truth-telling mechanism that might be a little bit different. And again, I would credit Dr. Assata Zerai for this idea, which was, rather than try to come up with a truth commission where people maybe from different ranks are telling even group stories can reveal individuals in an environment with small numbers, why don't we have a set of panels? And then what we decided together is to have a panel of experts. This panel is the first one. And it is to think about the implications for how do we design truth-telling mechanisms when you have a small number of faculty and identifiable on campus. The next set include experts on Blacks in New Mexico, UNM past and present directors of the program of Africana Studies. This is to lay out the history of harms towards Black faculty as well as Black people in New Mexico, especially taking into account the context of already having Black people here who had homes, who had businesses, who had assets that were taken away when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed and it became part of the United States. And then to end with directors and chairs of Africana Studies programs transitioning to department status. And I'd like to thank Dr. Diane Pender-Hughes and Dr. Melinda Price for agreeing already to serve on this panel. Next slide, please. So what we are beginning to think about is not a singular static truth commission, but a portfolio of truth-telling mechanisms, recognizing that not everyone is comfortable telling their truth at all or in the same form. So to think about the truth-telling panels that we're doing first, the institutional ethnographies that Dr. Assata Zerai and Dr. Nancy Lopez are already working on, laying out, which Dr. Zerai will talk about in her presentation, but laying out sort of the history, for example, of courses that have been taught with respect to race, gender, for example. Existing reporting mechanisms on campus as improvements are trying to be made, trying to understand when these are viable options when you've suffered a harm. The historical research to understand we're developing a timeline of the experience of Black people in New Mexico. And then finally, survivor testimony, which we're still working on. How do we create the safe space? How do we protect the data, for example? Next slide, please. And to end with, in recognition, and this is why it was important that I contextualize this effort as among several restorative justice efforts to address different kinds of legacies of harm in the university simultaneously. So in DEI, what we're working on is an edited volume called Universities Confronting Their Past, the University of New Mexico Addressing Multiple Legacies of Harm. The chapters will cover broadly, how does this effort fit nationally and internationally? Chapter 2, including the Zimmerman Library murals, university seal, the naming of the buildings, the totems, as well as thinking about a new model for how does a university confront its past. One of the innovative things that Dr. Zerai has done is taken DEI and made it a safe space for these efforts and brought them all in. And so what does it mean to have the Division of Equity and Inclusion an institutional home for restorative justice in higher education? And could it be a model for other universities as they begin to deal with multiple legacies of harm? And what we're going to do is an open call for papers, asking people on campus who are interested in writing about any of these topics, remembering that these are connected to social movements for 30 to 40 years about each one, where there have been people who have worked on it in different capacities in their life, maybe as an undergraduate, graduate student, assistant professor, senior faculty member, and then as an administrator, and their positionality on these issues is changing over time. We are very grateful to the people who, before transitional justice and restorative justice were buzz terms in academia, before we thought about the classroom as a space of truth and reconciliation, in that language, we're doing the work already, and we need to recognize that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the end of my presentation, and Dean Emeritus Alfred Mathewson will now speak on the issue of justice and small numbers. Thank you so much. And I'll turn over the slide to you, or control of the slides. Thank you, April.
You're on mute.
Now, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. All right. Yeah, I've been talking to you for a couple of minutes now. So let me just say in beginning that I have retired. I have done everything I came to New Mexico to do. I retired so that I could actually spend more time trying to do work in the South. I have an impact on the South, which is where I am from. But there are these two professors here, very brilliant professors doing exciting work, who keep pulling, wait, can you do one more thing? So that's a part of why I'm here. And so when I was asked to participate on the panel, I had not planned to do a PowerPoint, but Dr. Powers has wanted me to write on the concept of the constitutional insignificance of African Americans in New Mexico since I first told her the concept about it. And so it is my view that she asked me to do a PowerPoint so I could start putting something in writing. And so this is a start, and I'm not sure how this is going to come out because I am trying to think about how this would appear in writing. But this screen before you now, I'm going to just tell you that it's a quote and a paraphrase that I encountered here. And the first, that African Americans are constitutionally insignificant in New Mexico. That came to my attention during the 2010 redistricting process in New Mexico. Someone who had been paying attention to litigation called me and said an expert had testified in one of the court proceedings that African Americans are constitutionally insignificant in New Mexico. Would you look into it? And so I did. One of the lawyers involved in litigation told me that he did not recall someone saying that, but if it had come up, it would have been in the context of Corey County, which has an 8% Black population. It's the highest concentration of Blacks, highest percentage of Blacks in any county or city in New Mexico. And but the other thing was I was provided with a transcript of the expert's testimony, and I did not find the statement in the transcript. But nevertheless, the concept was there: constitutionally insignificant. African Americans constitutionally insignificant. The second time I encountered was the paraphrase was the next one, and this came up in the fairness hearing in dealing with the settlement agreement between the Department of Justice and the city of Albuquerque regarding the police department. I represent a group of amici organizations in that process, along with Representative Antonio Maestas, and our organizations were concerned that the findings letter and the settlement agreement did not contain provisions prohibiting racial bias. So we were seeking to get such provisions in the agreement. We were unsuccessful, but the agreement does now contain provisions to collect demographic data. But during the fairness hearing, one of the lawyers for the city, in addressing our concerns about racial bias, says something to the effect that we deny any racial profiling, but if it does occur, it's too small to be constitutionally significant, or at least too small to warrant a constitutional remedy of systemic proportions. And I said, wow, they're talking about Black people. That if it's happening here, it's happening with respect to Blacks, and the numbers are just so small. We don't need a systemic remedy, a provision in the settlement agreement, because it's small. It can be handled, I suppose, with individual remedies. So that was where I first encountered that concept. And every time I've done it, I've mentioned to Dr. Powers, and she keeps wanting me to talk about it more and then write about it. So here's the New Mexico population. It's a statewide 2 million people roughly, and about 54,000 African Americans. Now, I would tell you this, that I got these numbers off the internet, and so they must be true because that's where I found them, but it was a census website, and I think this was the year 2019. So 54,500 African Americans in a state of about 2.1 million. Most of that population, about 60%, is probably in the Albuquerque area. So those are the types of small numbers that you are talking about. So our numbers are small, and I want to talk about what that means in New Mexico with this small population and systemic harms. I think I must have lost. Yes, I've lost a slide, but I can tell you what the slide would have said. And I may have moved it around, and it may come up later. But what that slide will say is that African Americans are treated as constitutionally insignificant for remedies, but not too insignificant for constitutional harms. or for systemic harms, not too small for systemic harms. And a little history, systemic harms in New Mexico with their small numbers. New Mexico had a slave code enacted in 1858, and it specifically applied to persons of African descent. In 1861, and this was new to me till a couple of years ago, the southern part of New Mexico actually voted to secede from New Mexico and the Union and joined the Confederacy. It was accepted by the Confederacy, and thus New Mexico became the only Confederate territory. Systemic harm, because that was about this is the Civil War, the battles that were fought here in terms of the Confederacy coming to try to claim New Mexico as a territory. Now, Congress just mentioned that abolished slavery in the territories in 1862. So that slave code that was acted in 1858 was essentially thrown out by Congress in 1862. The University of New Mexico did not accept Blacks until 1921. Bertie Hardin applied in 1915 and was denied admission because she was Black. Her denial became an energizing moment for the local NAACP. They raised money to help pay her tuition should she get in. But it wasn't until 1921 that UNM changed its admissions policy to permit Blacks to enter. They moved to an open admissions policy. I do not know if Bertie Hardin ever attended UNM. The first Black student to graduate was Romeo Lewis in 1930. In 1925, the New Mexico legislature authorized school districts to operate segregated schools. Again, think about the numbers. It was 54,000 then, it was much smaller then. And so we're getting systemic harm imposed on small numbers, not too small for systemic harm. And then just because I do know that there is another university, at least one other in the state, and New Mexico State admitted its first Black student in 1928. I do not know what its admissions policies were. So again, small population, but not too small for systemic harms. What about today? What's happening today? Same thing. Systemic harms, even though small numbers. The 4-year high school graduation rate for Blacks nationally is 79%. In New Mexico, it's 69%. In APS, it's only 59%. And so what you're looking at is that, again, we're not just talking about compare it to the national average, but just in terms of what's happening with Blacks nationally. In New Mexico, small numbers, systemic harm. And then what I have following that are a number of things, of metrics dealing with the Black experience and where we are, systemic harms, small numbers, and can you get systemic remedies when you have small numbers, when you're getting systemic harms imposed on those small numbers. And now this one, over time, I have been collecting some data. So this is small print for a slide, and it is about the FY is just for informational purposes. It doesn't contain everything. Conspicuously absent from this timeline or anything dealing with faculty, with one exception, I should say, and which I will talk about later. So the terms of the arrival of faculty and their experience here, events dealing with faculty, that's not included. But the highlighted lines deal with Black studies, Africana studies here, dealing with that history beginning in 1969 with the Breaking the Chains report. And I pull them out separately to look at this, because one of the things about Black studies at UNM, this is a systemic remedy. There were small numbers here in 1969, but in the report, this is the other part about the small numbers, trying to figure out what those numbers are. And the report details their experience in terms of trying to identify the numbers of Black students were to get an accurate count, even of those small numbers. But it is a request for a systemic remedy in terms of the creation of a Black Studies program, which was done. But the thing about that remedy, it also called for departmental status. So they wanted a Black Studies program, and they wanted it to become a department, and they called for it in 1970, more than 50 years ago. And you notice at the very end, down at the bottom, we're now looking at a departmental transition committee. But the the reason that it has been 50 years, at least one of the reasons for 50 years, small numbers, a systemic remedy, but because the numbers are so small, too small for systemic resources, are significant enough resources to turn it into a department. We'll talk more about that too, but a systemic remedy, even though we're talking small numbers, but then limiting that remedy because of the small numbers. This one, again, numbers I pull, I put the student numbers in there, and I think I got that from US News and World Report. So that's the numbers that they report. The numbers I have for the faculty I actually got from the Office of Institutional Analytics, but I noticed that they differ from the numbers that you will see later from Dr. Zerai. Instead of 20, I think she shows 27, and I'd like her slide better, and I would take it as the more accurate, but we're still looking at small numbers. But I raised the faculty here because, again, small numbers, not too small for systemic harm. So a timeline that I have, 1969 through 2021. And why do we begin in 1969? So remember I said that timeline that I gave before did not include faculty with one exception. So over on this page, you will notice the very first highlight comes in 1969, breaking the chains, but just above it, also 1969, is Lionel Williams and the love lust controversy, a story that I did not hear about for nearly 25 years in the time that I came here. Lionel Williams was a graduate assistant who taught an English literature class. It was on erotic literature. The syllabus contained a trigger warning about what the class was about. And the class was very popular. And in fact, there were more people attending class than were registered for the class. But one of the students in the class was the daughter of a state legislator. And there was one assignment involved an erotic poem about oral sex. And she took the poem home and showed it to her father, who was outraged. He then led the passage of a resolution in the House of Representatives to demand that the university fire him for teaching such outrageous subject matter and subjecting freshman students to this. The resolution was approved with one no vote, and that was cast by the only, our first Black legislator, and he voted no, but he was the only no. But let me just tell you in terms of, this is a graduate student teaching a class, and the experience of Black faculty, there was a resolution to fire him. And so the university actually started proceedings, and he was represented by a law professor. And ultimately, there was a compromise and some sort of settlement in terms of what would happen. But that was, as a faculty member, teaching a class, academic freedom, but he's a Black faculty member. And one of the things in that that resolution, the language, just in terms, this was beyond microaggressions. Lionel Williams was his name, has offended the very foundation of decency in New Mexico by the distribution of pornographic materials to students in his classroom in his capacity as an instructor. The activities of this instructor have placed him outside the acceptable standards of decent citizens of New Mexico. The Board of Regents are hereby directed to forthwith remove this source of contamination from the campus of the University of New Mexico. And so in terms of what was said about him, this was a big controversy. It played a role in the governor's race that followed. But a faculty member, and the experience here at New Mexico, and this is just the beginning. And so when the time, those stories that Dr. Powers talked about and experiences that people have gone through and what they may want to talk about or may want to disclose, they may not have the exact or the experience that Lionel Williams had as a graduate student, but they do have some stories. And it begins in 1969 and in 2021. There are 20 to 27 African-American faculty members here now. Many of them will have stories. When they talk about their experience, they are dissatisfied with things that they have encountered. And the question for them will be, uh-oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Hold on, I'm gonna stop the share for a moment. While I figure out what just happened to me. Oh, that's what happened. Let's see if I can make it work. Yeah, there we go. So for faculty members, do we get individual or systemic remedies or both? So if you're a faculty member, just going through, and mind you, Lionel Williams was just a graduate student. He was not on tenure track. He was not a lecturer and was teaching, and in terms of what he was subjected to. But there are the whole process of just trying to get a job, to get on tenure track, to get retained, to attain tenure, to get promoted, the work that you do, how it is received for people, and in terms of what they wish to cover, but they get subjected to systemic harms. And I want to point out one thing about this context of these small numbers and systemic harms in New Mexico. Individuals are here, but the systemic harms are not necessarily local. African Americans in New Mexico are subjected to the same systemic harms in that occur nationally. This is a national set of systemic harms. Structural racism is national. And so in terms of remedies, but you have smaller numbers, do you get a remedy for what happens to you through those systemic harms on an individual basis? Or is there some sort of systemic remedy for you? And there are options. There are, as Dr. Powers talked about in terms of the portfolio of potential remedies as to how you might proceed. There may be some instance of individuals who, yes, I want something specific for me and I want to focus on that, even though the harms, again, the harms may be systemic, but I'm looking for an individual remedy. In some instances, individual cases could be used to gain systemic remedies. And because one case can be used in essence to change policies. And we take with the Derek Chauvin trial and what has happened there, we have one case. We have sort of an individual remedy for the Floyd family. There's no remedy for George Floyd, but in this instance of getting a conviction. But the hope is that it will have systemic impact and bring about systemic change And so you can focus in terms of, can you use sort of the individual cases to bring about systemic change? The other side of it is that, but you could focus on, wait a minute, we need systemic remedies. It's not just in terms of what happened to one individual, is what can you do to change things, to change the system, to prevent individual harms from occurring. And then Dr. Powers has pointed out a number of things about dealing with what that process might look like, whether it would have to be an open process or whether it would be, you can have a closed process. One of the things about New Mexico, the Inspection of Public Records Act is a very strong act in favor of disclosure and this being a public university. And essentially, if you produce a record that falls within it, it is subject to disclosure unless there is an explicit exception for it. Contracting with commercial entities may not get you out of it because of the strong reach of the statute. And there is some pending litigation now dealing with that issue. So I'm still thinking through this idea of we have small numbers, a need for systemic remedies, even though there are small numbers, and the need for systemic remedies is because the harms are systemic, not just individual. And I'm gonna stop with that.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. I'm so happy to learn about all of that. And we've been talking about this timeline project. And so thanks so much for presenting the timeline of Africana studies and Blacks in New Mexico in higher ed and at UNM in particular. So hi, everyone. April is going to show my slide deck for me. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what I will be discussing, and then we will get into it. So I'm gonna drill down in terms of looking at our numbers of Black faculty in New Mexico. And I think it's really important for us to pay attention to that in context. And so we'll look at numbers of all faculty in New Mexico, in addition to how we compare with our current peer institutions. And then I have a list there just to show you all the data that I will be showing you. So normally I have been presenting data that's focused on tenure system faculty, but I've broadened it in this presentation to include lecturers and instructors, as well as not only regular, but temporary faculty and full and part-time faculty. And of course, we'll be looking at main campus and HSC. But the only two branches we'll really be looking at are Gallup and Taos, where we have Black faculty employed currently. And then I'll end out my remarks with some discussion of alternative means to learn about the experiences of Black faculty in the face of this issue of small numbers. So on the next slide, I show you what we're talking about when we refer to those small numbers and how small they actually are relative to our colleagues in other racial categories. And so I've highlighted Black faculty in the fourth column. The first column lists the places on campus where we are employed in terms of main, HSC, and the branch campuses. And again, for context, I've given you the information for faculty from all racial, ethnic backgrounds. So we'll move on to the next slide. I'm not gonna make you too dizzy with this one, just to point out that in terms of thinking about where we fall in relation to our peer institutions, those institutions are listed on the left. And this is a brand new table. We just got the 2019 IPEDS information that allows us to compare to peer institutions. And I think actually I'm going to move on to the next slide, which shows the ranks, which I think will be, yeah, a little quicker. So in terms of women faculty, we've actually fallen. We were near the top in terms of the rank, our rank relative to women faculty, and now we're 11th. In terms of Native faculty, we're still number 1. In terms of African American faculty, we are 21st out of 23rd. And so that means we are near the bottom in terms of our percentages of Black faculty. And for Latino faculty, it is 6 out of the 23 institutions. So we'll go to the next slide. And so this one just gives you overall percentages. And this is for the entire campus, but this is tenure system faculty. And so that number was 27 when I pulled this back in November. Sometimes the numbers change a little bit as OIA updates their information. But you see in terms of the entire UNM system, we're less than 2%. So on the next slide is the breakdown in terms of rank. Again, here we're looking at tenure system faculty. And so we range from 1.4% to 1.8%, depending on the rank. And you can see that our numbers are about the lowest compared to other races. And so on the next slide, we take a look at our percentages by college, because it's really important to think not only of the global picture for all of UNM, but kind of where you live. And I point this out again in terms of thinking about what that problem of small numbers looks like. And so you see we have a couple colleges where we don't have Black faculty, and the numbers are pretty low in all the colleges. And so on the next slide, I show the breakdown for nursing, pharmacy, population health, and medicine within HSC, as well as the branch campuses. And we'll keep moving because, again, I told you I would not. I could talk about these all day, but I'm not going to do that today. And so for this slide, what it does is it breaks down the information in terms of full versus part-time faculty and by year. And so, again, this is what we mean by the problem of small numbers. And so we have a total of 46 Black faculty at UNM, and that's out of almost 2,964 faculty altogether. And this is a drop from 53 in 2016. So if you look at the totals, you can see that in the final column. And 8 are assistant professors, 11 are associate, 4 are instructors, 4 are lecturers, and we have 9 that are full professors. And we have 10, I discovered, who do not have a rank. And we're still trying to investigate to understand what that means. And then on the next slide, I created a crosstab that just shows you campus by rank. And again, what we mean by the problem of small numbers. So if you say, you know, I'm talking about a lecturer at Gallup, there's only one person who's a lecturer at Gallup. Or at HSC, the full professor at HSC, one person. And so that makes it really difficult in terms of creating even surveys, much less, you know, kind of oral history of what's happening in these departments. And then the final numbers slide, I promise, is this one where I wanted you to have a sense of what those particular numbers are by college as well as by rank. And so you can see again that if we talk about the Black faculty lecturer in education and human sciences, one person. So those small numbers make it really difficult, even when we do surveys, because if you don't have a small number of of at least 4 in your cell, then it's really even hard to get approval to report that out, because again, you're identifying the experiences of a particular individual. So on the next slide, what do we do? What are some ways that we can address this problem of small numbers, yet still collect useful information about the experiences that our faculty are having? And so one of the projects that we've actually talked about in a presentation on Tuesday is called the Ethnography of UNM, or EUNM, that we're going to get started. And we are using the liberating methodology of institutional ethnography to help us to analyze experiences of UNM BIPOC faculty, students, and staff. And the Sankofa bird is an Adinkra symbol where it's turning its neck to the side. And the whole idea, it says go back and get it, is go back and get your history. Go back and understand what's happened in the past so you can chart a better way forward for the future. And so on the next slide, in terms of just what that means, so we're going to help to build a more accurate and complete narrative of the history of New Mexico by going back and getting those histories of Black students, faculty, and staff. And institutional ethnography is an interpretive approach, very much driven, and the lens really comes from a critical feminist perspective. And it maps and makes visible the ruling relations that shape the experiences of faculty and communities across institutions. And it is a method that draws on a number of multidisciplinary insights. And so on the next slide, one of the big themes of institutional ethnography is making the invisible visible. And so for our work, that is the invisible work that Black faculty do in terms of advising BIPOC students. Often we need to over-prepare for teaching in order to try to keep that bias at the door that sometimes students bring to the classroom. And then often it means onerous service responsibilities. I'm sure everyone here has other examples. And so, of course, for those of us doing the work, it's not invisible at all, but often it's not seen when it comes time to review files for tenure and promotion or considerations for raises, et cetera. And so in doing this work, we hope to make that more visible. So on the next slide, some proposed elements of the ethnography of the UNM, which will be for restorative justice, include institutional timelines like the one that Dean Mathewson just presented, as well as chronological lists of Black faculty and what I call BIPOC firsts. So who was the first African-American to apply to UNM? And so Alfred talked about Birdie. I forgot her last name already, but how she applied and other firsts that he actually mentioned in his presentation. And then the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice is creating a list of race, gender, and social justice curricula across departments. And so for Africana Studies, one of the things we want to do is to create a list of all the courses taught by Black faculty through the decades, as well as lists of courses that cover, it should have an R in there, the Black experience. And so I will end there because I want to make sure we have some time for comments and questions. Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me to share that.
Thank you. So Frankie said that we have questions. How should we proceed so that people can ask them?
They're in the chat.
Okay.
I'm trying to flip it. I don't see
Right.
If you see one, just read it out for us.
Okay. There was one question that I remember asking, or the suggestion, Frankie, I'm not sure if it was you, that maybe that among the harms we may have experienced is being at a school or a university in which there was a shooting. So one of the suggestions was, this is a research question, to ask have you lived through a shooting before? And then to try to find out, like, how does that affect you and how you see harms within a university? I think that's a great one. I never thought of it. And I had never expected that. I thought of school shootings as in high schools or elementary schools, and it never occurred to me that I'd be at a university at the time that it happened. And it's made me very concerned about harms towards faculty. So I think that's a really great research question. And I apologize because I can't remember who put that in the chat.
Sure, it was Anya.
Anya? Okay, thank you so much, Anya.
And the next question was, there are issues of land grant universities that profit off of Indigenous lands. According to one source, there are at least 16 land grant universities profiting from expropriated Indigenous lands retained through the Morrill Act.
And so is the question, or is this information that's being shared? I just want
information that's being shared.
Okay, great, and thank you. Because I think this is a really important distinction in terms of what does restorative justice look like in this context. And what's happening with some universities is that so let's just take those who have maybe the legacy of slavery and on Indigenous land. Are they dealing with them simultaneously? Are they dealing with them sequentially? Or what are the consequences of doing so? And how does that impact relations between those groups? So this is great, and thank you, because I hadn't thought about a class of universities dealing with that form of legacy of harm. So thank you.
There was also a question for Dean Mathewson.
Okay.
Dean Mathewson from Sonia Rankin was wondering why your name was not on the Dean list that you had shared.
Good question.
Because when I first prepared the Dean list, it stopped with Dean Pender, who was the first African-American to be named Dean at the university. And I wish that there were actually two interim deans prior to Dean Pender, Dr. Shyamia Cooner and Dr. Penny Coleman both served terms as interim deans at University College. So their names aren't there either. And then I added the other deans were added because it's 2020 and it happened now. I mean, it was 2020 when in terms of adding it.
We have two additional questions, one from Sonia Rankin. What can we do in our individual units in support of this work?
Well, one of the things that I suggest that I mentioned in my presentation the other day is to get your students to do the work. You know, get your students, assign projects to your students so they can learn more about the history of UNM and share it with the rest of us. Add entries to the timeline that Dean Mathewson started. And yeah, I think just for us to kind of crowdsource the information so that we can have a more complete history is really important. And then I think also to create space in your courses for students to, you know, work through some of the difficulties that they may be encountering on campus. And so Marissa Greenberg, one of our upcoming fellows in DEI, is proposing some writing projects where you can kind of write through those experiences as a way of working through, you know, those difficulties.
Our next question is from Mala Tun. Restorative justice usually involves perpetrators as well, so they change. What is your plan for engaging the entire community in this project?
This is a great question. So I'll say I'll tackle it first, and then Assata, if you want to jump in. So first, one of the things we're exploring is whether or not restorative justice is the appropriate model. So there in the Diversity Council, there's a subcommittee called the Restorative Justice Committee that Liz Hutchinson chairs. And so we are spending this semester learning about restorative justice and thinking about it in an interdisciplinary way. And the basic model of restorative justice that requires negotiation between victim and, for lack of a better term, perpetrator, that would involve that they communicate with each other and negotiate a plan going forward. One of the things we've talked about is, how do you do that? Does that work? How does that work across different issue areas? Do we have to be concerned about the victim feeling coerced into participating in the process? Maybe they don't. I would actually say the truth-telling panels are reflective of what you're saying, because it is our first truth-telling effort, and we invited everyone to come so that we can begin to talk about, learn about. And I think that's probably the first thing in the truth-telling process, is to educate ourselves about the legacies of harm, the problems that are involved. And the truth-telling panels allow us to do that. And it allows us, I think, the university as a community to do so. And I think it's important that it's a series of panels and not just one, because as we go on, and there was a question about community, I think that was from Dr. Melinda Price. Yeah. We have panelists who are from the community, who are experts on the history of Blacks in New Mexico, on the legacies of harm. We have experts from different departments on campus. And I want to make clear also, to get back to Mala's question, the Truth Commission Committee and the Restorative Justice Committee are very diverse in terms of composition. And so they actually include faculty from all over campus, which has been really great to have people's different perspectives about how this might work. And then we report back to the Black Faculty Alliance in order to get feedback, but we have multiple mechanisms of feedback and input. And then we have multiple mechanisms to share the information that we're gathering. And the anonymous, did you want to weigh in, Assata, before I go on? Oh, okay. So for the next comment, which I think is the comment. Okay, so what does this do? Okay, part of telling the truth is collecting information, right? And we're collecting data. And I understand what you're getting at, because this just forward our careers, for example. No, it's important because from a DEI perspective, that information is going to be used to create interventions in order to address the problems that we see. And so our goal is systemic change. And in very particular ways to understand and to collect data from an intersectional perspective, so we can really understand holistically how people are affected, how classes of people are impacted, and then how to address it. And let me make clear, this is just one effort. DEI is working on targeting of faculty across many dimensions. The BIPOC community, based on gender, based on sexual identity. This is just one effort. And given the disparity, are planning to use, what's the ideal way for staff to support these efforts across the university? What would participation support look like? Thank you for this question, because we see the Black Faculty Truth Commission as one step, not just in dealing with harms towards Black faculty and faculty in general, but recognizing that staff, graduate students also face legacies of harm. And this is just the beginning, and there are other efforts already underway in DEI, which I'll let Assata talk about the survey as a way to gather information. As far as staff working with us, which I think is great, I think it might be a great idea for us to go and present to the UNM Staff Council to give them a chance to weigh in on what we're doing from their perspective and to give us suggestions about how to deal with the harms that they face.
I actually would love to invite Dean Mathewson to talk about alternative ways of collecting stories. In our conversation, he had some great ideas. So often in a truth commission, you have people sort of getting up in front of a group and telling their story, which again, we don't think that's necessarily the safest thing for our very small numbers of Black faculty. But Dean Mathewson had some ideas about faculty reporting to one another.
Well, yeah, this goes back to the portfolio, uh, and of trying to think of options in terms of how stories might be told. One option is to have Black faculty tell stories to each other. I mean, they might share, and it's not a question of collecting data, but just an opportunity to talk about their experience. That they may have spoken to somebody about the experience. They may not. So some people have kept it inside, but they may appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. Some people may want to. I mean, think about sort of little stories of writing something, a journal, just essays, an essay of your experience. Again, and those essays can be shared. You could have a private setting just in terms of sharing the essays and reading the stories. So you can think about ways in which you can do something smaller in terms of telling the stories. You can think about ways to do it publicly. You could have um, these days you can't control people necessarily who would try to uh, record you so if it's public, but I've actually my uh, inclinations that there are times when things should be public, and so just in terms of thinking about, okay, we've told these stories to each other, which ones should we try to make public? And particularly if you want action. So if you want action at some point, you have to do something publicly. So trying to tell stories privately may be something that's good for you, and that's something that you enjoy doing. But that systemic, if you want a remedy for the systemic harm, something has to be done publicly. But even in terms of what gets done publicly, or at least in terms of the remedy, I mean, I'm just thinking of restorative justice mechanisms, and there are options for that. Some people may want an OEO claim. They want the process. So knowing what the process is for being able to do something about the experience. Some people may want to remedy it. It's just that they don't want necessarily the formal process. I was approached by somebody in the community a couple of years ago who just wanted, not at the university, but had an experience with her employer, and she wanted the opportunity to sit down face to face with the supervisor to tell, I want you to know what you did to me, how you made me feel, and I want you to sit there and listen and be quiet. You can't say anything. I get to talk to you. But that was what she wanted, and it happened. And so you can think about different ways in terms of, I want to tell my story, but also in terms of, I want to get my truth out, but what do you want done with it? Do you want an individual remedy? Do you want a systemic remedy? Do you want something formal? Do you want something informal? And so just thinking about the options that may be. You may, I can think of, I may want um, to tell my story, but not to anyone, but the process of writing my story for myself. I have, it's my personal record. That's not subject to disclosure. uh, but I mean, but giving people options for telling their stories, and then thinking about the connection between story and remedy.
Thank you. So we are 5 minutes over time. So I think we should probably, well, I can check the question and answer and see if there's anything we missed.
I did want to say one thing about that community question.
Okay.
Because I do think the focus of the commission have been on faculty. I mean, we're not even covering students in this, but we're focusing on faculty. But it may be, as we talk, we start thinking about students, staff, a community as well in terms of processes for them.
Yeah, I think the forum that we held last night, where we had a number of staff members share their reflections on the recent verdict, and and many of them extrapolated to their own experiences on campus. That seemed to be, just such an important space, because faculty, we're out here talking all the time. Students, we're giving them the spotlight a lot. But I do think that it's important that we're really intentional about making sure we capture the stories of staff so that we can address them, not just to hear the stories, but to think about remedies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would encourage all of you, as you're planning your events and, thinking about future engagements, to think about ways to incorporate staff, because we would not be successful in anything we do here without staff. So it's really important to support their professional development and support their happiness and work environment.
Mm-hmm. And there are ways that they can be even more vulnerable if they also teach, for example, or graduate students who teach and are also students at the same time. And to think about these complex overlapping roles that they fill and that make them more vulnerable. I think we need to work on that also. So I think we kind of tackled all the big questions. I'm sure we missed something, and I deeply apologize. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I would really like to thank our panelists for an awesome panel. I knew they were going to be fabulous, and they exceeded my expectations. This is more than I'd hoped for. So thank you, and thank you to the DEI staff, because it absolutely couldn't have happened without all of you. And thank you for everyone who participated.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your leadership, Kathy, in this, and expertise.
Thank you. Thank you to you for yours.
All right, everyone.
We're done.
Thank you all for joining us. Bye.
Bye.